My fiancée ran off with a flashy doctor and left me a note on my birthday. That was the day I began crafting a quiet, meticulous revenge that no amount of money could ever stop. I'm a 36-year-old man working as a civil engineer for a mid-sized firm. Until recently, I was engaged to a woman named Andrea, 31, who I believed was the love of my life. We'd been a couple for 4 solid years, and for 3 of those, she lived with me in the house I bought. It wasn't extravagant, but it was mine. After my father passed away and left me a modest inheritance, I used that money to place a respectable down payment on a 3-bedroom home situated in a reliable middle-class neighborhood. The place had good bones, a manageable mortgage, and a decently sized backyard. It even had the space for a dog, the one I had always wanted, but never got, because Andrea claimed she was allergic. I grew up in a blue-collar household. My father worked tirelessly as a plumber, and my mother served as a secretary at a local elementary school. They were the type of people who believed in hard work, modest living, and doing things yourself. They sacrificed a lot to send me to college and put me through engineering school. My dad was the kind of guy who could keep anything running, and he took immense pride in maintaining his 1989 Chevy Silverado by hand. He taught me how to change the oil when I was just 12 years old. To this day, I drive a used 2010 Toyota Tacoma that I purchased with 80,000 miles already on it. It's not flashy, but it runs well and gets the job done. Andrea never stopped reminding me that my truck was too old and, in her eyes, too unprofessional to be seen in when meeting clients. She constantly suggested that I upgrade to something more modern and stylish. But I refused to go into debt just for the sake of appearances. After my dad's sudden heart attack 5 years ago, I made a silent vow to honor the opportunities his sacrifices had afforded me. I got a stable job, purchased a home, and not long after, met Andrea at a wedding hosted by one of my friends. Back then, I genuinely thought I had everything lined up for a bright, secure future. Andrea worked in pharmaceutical sales and earned a comfortable income, about $85,000 a year plus commissions. Between the two of us, we weren't rolling in money, but we lived comfortably. We weren't extravagant, but we didn't want for much either. The wedding was scheduled for the following summer, and we had already placed $4,000 in non-refundable deposits. Her parents generously offered to cover the majority of the wedding expenses, though we chipped in wherever we could. There were subtle cracks in our relationship that I now realize I should have noticed. One glaring moment occurred when I got promoted at work. I was over the moon and took Andrea out to a nice dinner to celebrate. Instead of being excited or proud, she spent the entire evening peppering me with questions about whether the promotion came with a company car or an expense account. When I told her it didn't, her reaction was a lackluster, disinterested "oh," before she shifted the conversation to something else entirely. Another incident that sticks out happened after I went grocery shopping. I had picked up a few essentials, including store-brand cereal instead of the organic label she usually insisted on. That seemingly small choice triggered a full-blown argument that lasted over an hour. She accused me of never listening, of being indifferent to her health and needs, all over a box of cereal. From there, things started to unravel. Roughly 6 months ago, Andrea's work schedule grew increasingly erratic. She had more client dinners, more late nights, and came home frequently smelling of cologne. When questioned, she claimed it was from hugging clients goodbye. I also started finding receipts from upscale restaurants, places we couldn't normally afford, buried at the bottom of her purse. When I brought it up, she accused me of trying to control her spending and invading her privacy. Then there was Joseph, a longtime buddy of mine since our college days. He works in IT at the very hospital where Andrea had several pharmaceutical clients. Slowly, his behavior toward me changed. He began canceling our weekly basketball games, often with flimsy excuses. Even when we managed to hang out, he avoided eye contact and kept things awkwardly short. In hindsight, I can't believe how blind I was. My birthday came around just last month. I took the day off work, hoping for a quiet day at home with my cat, Max. Max is a one-eyed orange tabby I adopted 3 years ago from a local shelter. From day one, he followed me around like a shadow. Andrea merely tolerated him, never warmed up to him. That morning, while I was brewing coffee, Andrea handed me a small, neatly wrapped gift box. She smiled and said, "Don't open it until tonight, okay?" She pecked my cheek quickly and added, "I've got a dinner meeting with the regional director, but I'll be back by 10, and we'll celebrate then." I gave a small nod and put the gift on the coffee table, trying not to read too much into it. Evening came, and by 8 p.m., I was nestled on the couch, Max comfortably purring in my lap. I figured, why not open the present early? Inside the box was a sleek black hoodie bearing the logo of our favorite band, a thoughtful touch. I smiled faintly until I noticed a small card attached to the inside of the box flap. It read, "Check the pocket." Curious, I slipped my hand into the hoodie's front pocket and pulled out a piece of folded paper. It wasn't a receipt. It was a letter. A goodbye letter. "Victor, I can't do this anymore. The wedding, the house, the future we've mapped out. It isn't what I want. I've found someone else who makes me feel alive again. By the time you read this, I'll already be gone with the essentials. I'll come back for the rest later. I'm truly sorry it had to end this way." Just like that, 4 years of shared memories, laughter, arguments, holidays, and late-night talks, gone, ended in a few detached sentences hidden in a hoodie pocket on my birthday. I sat there, holding that letter in stunned silence. My brain was trying to untangle the timeline, trace back the red flags I had chosen to ignore. The lingering hugs with clients, her guarded phone, the impromptu weekend work trips, the constant nitpicking and arguments. Maybe she was picking fights on purpose, trying to justify her own betrayal. Just 2 weeks before, she had made a snide remark about my Tacoma, while her colleague rolled up beside us in a brand new BMW. "Maybe one day we'll upgrade to something built in this century," she had laughed, slipping her arm around mine. Her colleague chuckled, and I felt like a teenager again, not measuring up, not being enough. I called her voicemail. I sent a text. No response. I walked into our bedroom and was met with the cold clarity of absence. Half her clothes were gone. Her jewelry box was missing. I sat on the bed and Max brushed up against my leg, purring softly. At least one soul in the house was still loyal. Opening a soda, I wandered back to the couch and stared at the walls. That's when a thought struck me. Our shared cloud storage. Andrea wasn't particularly tech-savvy. She had no clue that her photos were being automatically backed up and synced to our shared cloud drive. There they were. Photos. Dozens of them. Andrea and some guy, tall, broad-shouldered, the kind who probably lived at the gym and always wore suits that screamed, "expensive." They were smiling together in candle-lit restaurants, posing outside a rustic cabin, and lounging on a boat. The timestamps didn't lie. This had been happening for over 4 months. Every image told a story, and every one of them made my stomach churn. But the one that really set my blood on fire was tucked away in a folder labeled "Weekend Getaway." In it, Andrea and this mystery man were standing in front of my truck, the one I let her use after her lease ended. They each had a weekend bag, clearly using my vehicle as their getaway chariot. Fury boiled in my chest as I dove deeper into the cloud drive. That's when I found the backups of her text messages. Her not being tech-savvy had worked in my favor. The guy's name was Dorian. Of course it was. A neurosurgeon at the very hospital where Andrea made her sales calls. The stereotype practically wrote itself. Reading their conversations was like willingly walking into a buzzsaw. Andrea gushed about how thrilling her life felt now, how suffocated she'd been with me, how she couldn't wait to start her real life with Dorian, as soon as she figured out how to exit our relationship without any blowback. My phone vibrated, snapping me out of the nauseating dive into betrayal. It was a text from Joseph. "Dude, I need to talk. It's important." I called him, instantly. "What's going on?" I asked, heart racing. There was a long pause on the line before he finally spoke. "I've been seeing Andrea around the hospital a lot. With someone. I didn't know how to tell you." "Dorian," I said, already knowing. "Yeah," he replied, surprised. When did you find out?" "When did you first see them together?" I asked. "About 3 months ago in the cafeteria. They were pretty close." I thought maybe it was just professional at first. But then last month I caught them in the parking garage. Kissing. He exhaled hard. I've been trying to figure out how to tell you. Why didn't you say something sooner? I asked, struggling to keep my voice level. She saw me, the day I caught them. She came to my office and told me that if I said anything, she'd file a harassment complaint with HR. I could have lost my job, man. I've got Jen and the twins to think about. I swear I was going to tell you. I just needed to find the right way. It's not your fault, I said after a beat. She's gone now anyway. Left me a note. On my birthday. Jesus Christ, Joseph muttered. What are you going to do? I don't know yet, I replied. But I'll think of something. The next morning, I made a few calls. First was to my father's old friend, now my insurance agent. I canceled the wedding insurance policy and explained why. He listened silently before saying, Son, I need to call your Uncle Paul. He'd want to know. 2 hours later, Uncle Paul showed up on my porch, carrying a 6-pack of Dad's favorite beer. He didn't say much at first, just handed me a drink and sat down next to me. Had to do the same thing for your cousin Tyler last year, he finally said. Better to end an engagement than sign up for a lifetime of misery. We sat there drinking, the silence between us heavy, but oddly comforting. After a while, he said something that hit me harder than I expected. Your dad would have handled this the same way you are. Quiet, calm, with a clear head. That's dignity, son. That was the highest form of praise Paul could give. The next week I took personal leave from work, not to sulk, but to act. The first thing I did was change every single lock in the house. Then I tackled the finances. We had a joint bank account with around $12,000, mostly money from my recent bonus. I transferred every cent into my personal account. It had my name on it, not hers. Legally, there was no argument. Next, I contacted the wedding venue and photographer. I explained what had happened, and to my surprise, both were incredibly understanding. The venue manager, Diane, even offered to convert the deposit into a credit for a future event in my name. That conversation felt like the first small victory in days. I spent the rest of the week collecting and organizing digital evidence. I built a folder structure, screenshots of photos, copied texts, all time-stamped and ordered by date. I wasn't sure yet what I'd use them for, but it felt necessary, like I was regaining some control. I stayed up past 2 a.m. most nights, combing through hospital staff directories until I located Dorian's profile. Chief neurosurgeon, Harvard med grad, classic golden boy. I even started a spreadsheet mapping Andrea's supposed client dinners to his surgery schedule. The overlaps were uncanny. Through our shared iPad, I accessed Andrea's Instagram activity. It was a goldmine. Every like, every comment between her and Dorian had been quietly happening for 6 months. By day 4 of my deep dive, my phone rang again. Andrea. Victor, we need to talk about picking up the rest of my things. No greeting, no apology, just business. Your stuff is fine, I replied. I changed the locks. You can come tomorrow at 6 to get it. You what? You can't do that. Half that house is basically mine. I laughed out loud. Really? Your name isn't on the deed. It's not on the mortgage either. You've never paid a cent of property tax or insurance. So which half exactly do you claim ownership of? We're engaged. That counts for something. We were engaged, past tense, just like your honesty, your fidelity, your commitment. There was silence on the line before she snapped, This is so typical of you. Always technical instead of reasonable. You left me a note, on my birthday, and moved in with another man. Don't lecture me about what's reasonable. Fine. Be that way. My dad will be calling you. And he did. Thomas Whitfield, Esca, called the next day, speaking with the forced calm of someone who'd spent his entire life winning petty arguments. I'm calling on behalf of my daughter Andrea, he began. She'll be coming by with a police officer to retrieve her belongings. Also, expect to hear from our legal team regarding the property. I took a breath. Mr. Whitfield, before you start throwing around threats, you might want to have a chat with Andrea, specifically about the contents of our shared cloud account, particularly the files from Lakeside Inn in March and your family cabin in April. I imagine those would interest you. I'm happy to share those files with Mrs. Whitfield if necessary, I said, my voice even. There was a long, heavy pause on the other end of the call. Finally, Thomas replied, "I'll call you back." He never did. Instead, about an hour later, Andrea sent a text that was entirely in character. "You're an a-hole. What time can I get my stuff?" No remorse, no apology, just pure audacity. We arranged for the upcoming Saturday. Predictably, she didn't show up with Dorian. Instead, she brought her younger sister, Clara, a smart move on Dorian's part. He probably didn't want to risk another confrontation, and honestly, I wasn't in the mood for one either. That morning, I'd already packed up all of Andrea's remaining belongings. I used black trash bags and basic cardboard boxes. Nothing fancy, nothing sentimental. Every item was sorted with clinical precision. When they pulled into the driveway in her white Range Rover, another gift courtesy of her father's deep pockets, I was already seated on the front steps, Max curled up in my lap, purring softly. I didn't even look in their direction. Clara exited the passenger side first. She'd always been the polar opposite of her sister, quiet, thoughtful, a little bookish. She looked visibly uncomfortable, like she'd been dragged into something she didn't want to be part of. As Andrea hauled boxes into the back of the SUV, Clara shuffled awkwardly over and offered a hesitant, "Sorry about all this." "Not your fault," I replied, still not looking up. She paused for a second. "For what it's worth," she added, "I think she's making a huge mistake." That caught my attention. I glanced at her. "Yeah?" Clara nodded, lowering her voice. "Dorian's got a reputation. This isn't the first time he's done this." My eyes narrowed. "Go on." "Last year," she whispered, "he pulled the same thing with a nurse. Left his fiancée for her. Then, 3 months in, he got bored and dumped the nurse. Just like that. Cold." She glanced nervously back at the house. "But don't tell Andrea I said anything. She's convinced this is some epic love story." I offered her a small, appreciative nod. "Your secret's safe with me." Later that evening, my phone rang. It was Clara. Her voice was anxious. "Victor, there's something else. I saw Andrea take some things that weren't hers." "What things?" "She grabbed that signed baseball your dad gave you, and your grandfather's watch. I saw her wrap them in her scarf and stuff them in a bag when you weren't looking." "Are you sure?" "Positive," she said firmly. "She said since you kept the engagement ring, she deserved something valuable too." The engagement ring. I hadn't even thought about it. A 2-carat diamond that cost me nearly $15,000, almost every penny I had saved at the time. That ring was meant to be a promise, a legacy, and now it was just another reminder of her betrayal. After we hung up, I sat in my father's old recliner, the same one Andrea always insisted was ugly and tried to throw out. I leaned back, Max curling up beside me, and began planning. This wasn't about heartbreak anymore. This was about integrity, respect, and legacy. I needed to know more about Dorian. And I had a way in. Joseph. But I had to tread carefully, considering Andrea had already threatened his job. We arranged to meet at a small diner several miles from the hospital, somewhere quiet where no one would recognize us. "He goes by Dorian Chamberlain," Joseph began, sliding a steaming cup of coffee across the table to me. "Chief neurosurgeon, early 40s. Makes close to $800,000 a year. Divorced twice." "Twice?" I blinked. "Andrea knows?" Joseph shook his head. "Probably doesn't care. You should see his lifestyle. Custom-tailored suits, a Maserati, high-end watches. It's the full, I'm a big deal routine." "What do the hospital administrators think of him?" "That's the thing," Joseph said, lowering his voice. "They don't like him much. He's great at what he does, no doubt, but he's difficult. There have been formal complaints about how he treats nurses, and there are rumors." "Rumors?" "About prescriptions. Stuff is going missing. Controlled meds. Nothing proven, but enough that HR keeps an eye on him." I nodded slowly. Anyone else I should talk to? There's someone who might help. Stephanie. She used to date him. She works in the ER now. Transferred departments after they broke up. She might have some stories. I made it my mission to find Stephanie. A quick glance at the hospital's staff directory, combined with a little social media sleuthing, helped me match her face to a name. Blonde, mid-30s, and judging from her photos, perpetually exhausted. I positioned myself at a coffee shop across from the hospital and waited through 3 full shift changes until I spotted her. I approached gently. "Excuse me. Stephanie?" She looked up, wary. "I need 5 minutes. I think we've got a mutual connection. Dorian Chamberlain." Her expression turned cold. "I've got nothing to say about that asshole. He's with my fiancée now. Or ex-fiancée." That stopped her. "Seriously? She's a sales rep at the hospital, right?" I nodded. "Of course, that's his type. Women who admire him professionally. It gives him control." She glanced around the cafe. "I really shouldn't be talking about this in public. I just want to understand what I'm up against." She paused, then relented. "Fine. 5 minutes." We moved to a quiet corner. Over the next 10 minutes, Stephanie laid it all out. Dorian had pursued her even while engaged. He'd made promises, said he'd leave his fiancée, and eventually he did. But once Stephanie moved in, he grew possessive, accusatory. If she worked late, he assumed she was cheating. When she discovered some unlabeled pill bottles in his locker and questioned him, he flipped, threatening to destroy her career if she spoke a word. "He's a narcissist," she concluded, "and possibly an addict, but he's untouchable. His father's on the hospital board. Andrea's just another piece in a long pattern." I stared at her, stunned. "So what happens next?" "He'll wine and dine her, love bomb her. Then when she stops idolizing him or stumbles onto something ugly, he'll discard her, just like the rest." She leaned in slightly. "If you're smart, you'll count your blessings. You dodged a disaster, but if you really want to get back at him, target his reputation. That's the only thing he truly cares about." As she stood to leave, she added, "And do yourself a favor. Don't try to save her. People like her, they have to learn the hard way." I watched her walk out into the evening sun, the weight of her words sinking in. My phone buzzed. A new text. It was from Thomas Whitfield. "Meet me tomorrow, 2 p.m. Riverfront Cafe. Come alone." Andrea's father wanted a private meeting. This should be interesting. I showed up 15 minutes early and claimed a quiet corner table with my back to the wall and full view of the door. When Thomas arrived, he looked exactly as you'd expect a high-powered attorney to look. Polished gray hair, tailored charcoal suit, eyes that could pierce through a lie in seconds. He walked with confidence, with authority, and with an air of someone used to being obeyed. The moment Thomas Whitfield entered the cafe, his stride exuded all the polished confidence of a man used to commanding rooms. But when he spotted me already seated in the corner, back to the wall and eyes fixed on him, his step hitched ever so slightly. That pause, that flicker of hesitation, was enough. He knew this wouldn't be a negotiation on his terms. He approached briskly and got straight to the point. "I want to discuss your evidence and how we can resolve this situation amicably." "You mean the photos? The texts?" I asked, tilting my head. "The pictures of your daughter with her lover of several months, or the screenshots where she outlines how to leave me without drama, or maybe the images of them together at your family's cabin. That one's particularly scenic." His jaw tightened, but the only visible reaction was a quick glance toward the neighboring tables. When I mentioned the cabin, his composure cracked just enough to reveal a flash of embarrassment. "I had no idea they were using the property," he muttered. "Well, they were," I replied calmly. "Very thoroughly, if the photos are any indication." He cleared his throat, visibly uncomfortable. "What exactly do you want?" "My father's signed baseball, my grandfather's watch, both of which your daughter took when she left, and I want the $4,000 in wedding deposits, money that came out of my pocket." Thomas nodded after a moment, as though tallying the damage. I'll see to it. You'll have everything by the end of the week. He turned as if to leave, but paused at the edge of the table. For what it's worth, he said, his voice quieter now, I don't condone how she handled any of this. Her mother and I raised her better. As he began to walk away, I called after him. Oh, and one more thing. Tell Andrea that if anything else mysteriously disappears, if even a spoon goes missing, those photos won't just stay on my hard drive. They'll go to your wife, your law partners, and anyone else who might find them. Enlightening. 3 days later, a discreet courier arrived at my office with a plain package. Inside were my father's autographed baseball, my grandfather's heirloom watch, and a cashier's check for exactly $4,000. There was no note, of course. I hadn't expected one. That evening, a new message flashed on my phone. It was from Clara. Can we meet? It's important. We met at a low-lit bar downtown, the kind of place where voices never carry and secrets feel safe. Clara looked tense, her hands constantly shifting around her glass. What's going on? I asked after we sat down. Andrea doesn't know I'm here, she began. But I thought you should know what's happening. She's miserable. That's no longer my concern. I know. But Dorian, he's showing his true colors already. Controlling. Jealous. He checks her phone, questions her constantly about every male client. Last week he showed up unannounced at one of her business dinners. Made a scene. I raised an eyebrow. Still not seeing how this involves me. Clara sighed. She's talking about quitting her job, because he doesn't like her working with male doctors. She's giving up everything for this guy. And you know why she left you the way she did, don't you? I gave her a look. She couldn't face you. She knew if she had to look you in the eye, she might not go through with it. That's why the note. She was a coward. I leaned back in my chair. Why are you really telling me this, Clara? She hesitated, then met my gaze. Because you cared. You really cared about her. And not like Dorian. He sees her as a trophy, something to show off. But you deserved better than the way she treated you. I'm doing fine, I said evenly. Moving on. Of course, she said quickly, eyes darting to the side. I just thought you should know. We finished our drinks in relative silence. But as I walked home that night, her words echoed in my mind. Was this just concern for her sister, or was there something else beneath the surface? Regardless, one thing was now clear. I had more allies than I ever expected. Joseph is at the hospital. Stephanie, with her knowledge of Dorian's dark habits. Clara, offering glimpses behind the scenes of Andrea's unraveling fairy tale. And Thomas, who'd do whatever it took to keep his wife from discovering those cabin photos. Over the following weeks, I began setting my plan into motion. It was methodical and required patience. 2 things I had in abundance now that wedding planning was off my calendar. Step 1 was reconnecting with Craig, a college buddy who now worked with the state medical board. Over a casual dinner, I carefully steered the conversation toward regulatory protocol. Say someone had legitimate concerns about a doctor, I asked. Prescriptions, for example. What would that process look like? Craig leaned in, serious. If controlled substances are involved, it triggers a formal review. But false reports? They can backfire hard. You'd better be sure. Good to know, I said. Hypothetically, of course. A few days later, I met Stephanie for dinner again. She was wary at first, but eventually opened up. I once found oxycodone in his gym bag, she admitted. No prescription. He claimed it was for a lingering football injury, but there were way too many pills, and he never mentioned that injury before. She paused. Some days he was wired, almost manic. Then he'd vanish for 30 minutes and come back sluggish, his pupils like pinpricks. Would you ever go on record? She shook her head. I can't. Not unless it becomes official first. But if someone else brought it to light, I wouldn't stop them. Meanwhile, Clara and I began seeing each other more frequently. Coffee chats turned into casual meals. She'd keep me informed about the circus that was Andrea's life with Dorian. "He's throwing a big housewarming," she said one day, rolling her eyes. "Andrea just moved into his mansion, $1.2 million in the fancy part of town. She wants everyone to see their perfect life. Dad's going because there'll be hospital executives there. But Mom?" She refused. And then came the final piece. Joseph texted, "Heads up. Dorian's scheduled for a high-profile surgery Monday. VIP patient. Senator's daughter. Local media's involved." The timing couldn't have been more perfect. The night before their grand event, I filed an anonymous report with the state medical board. The contents were damning, yet deliberately restrained, just enough to spark a real investigation without revealing my hand. I outlined suspicions that Dr. Dorian Chamberlain may have been impaired while performing patient care. I attached several dates, cross-referenced with hospital logs that Joseph had helped identify, instances where controlled medication counts didn't match usage records. Everything I included could be verified with internal audits. It wasn't speculation. It was a fuse waiting to be lit. Next, I reached out to a friend who worked hospital security, someone I trusted. I slipped him $200 and asked for just one favor. "Let me know if anything interesting happens during Dorian's shifts next week." He nodded silently. That was all I needed. Of course, I didn't attend the party. I had no desire to watch that charade unfold in person, but Clara sent me a steady stream of updates and photos throughout the night. Andrea wore a designer dress, her makeup flawless, her smile plastic. She clung to Dorian's arm like a prized possession as he played the charming host, entertaining guests with practiced ease. Andrea's father, Thomas, was seen schmoozing with senior hospital executives, glasses of expensive wine in hand. From the outside, it looked like a picture-perfect celebration. Affluent, prestigious, untouchable. And that's exactly what I wanted, because the higher they climbed, the more dramatic the fall. The Monday following the party, Dorian performed the high-profile surgery on the senator's daughter without a hitch, or so it seemed. There was no indication on the surface that anything was amiss. The media praised the hospital's success, hailing Dorian as a world-class surgeon. What didn't make it into the headlines, however, was a quietly implemented hospital policy change, just in time for the event. That morning, every member of Dorian's surgical team was randomly drug-tested. Convenient timing, suspiciously targeted. Tuesday morning, I received a text from my friend in security. Dr. C called an emergency meeting with the admin. Left pissed. That was all it said, but I read between the lines. By Wednesday, Joseph reached out. Dorian hadn't shown up at the hospital. Unusual. By Friday, rumors were circling like vultures. Suspension. Investigation. Something to do with drugs. I didn't move. Didn't speak of it to anyone. Patience was key now. This wasn't a game of chess anymore. It was attrition. The following Tuesday, Clara called, her voice full of panic. "Victor, everything's falling apart." "What do you mean?" "Dorian's license has been suspended. There's an investigation. Something about substance abuse. Andrea's losing it." "How's she taking it?" "She's in complete denial," Clara replied. "Keeps insisting it's a setup, that someone's trying to ruin him. And get this, she just found out he's had 3 ex-fiancées. Not 2. 3, I let out a dry chuckle. "Sounds like she's waking up." "It gets worse," Clara said. "The hospital board is meeting tomorrow. They're considering termination. His malpractice insurance is pulling out. If they cancel, he's done. He won't be able to practice anywhere." "And Andrea?" "She's not on any of his accounts. But she's on the lease. She spent most of her savings furnishing the place. She thought she was building a life with him. Now he's unraveling, and she's stuck." "Sounds unfortunate," I said evenly, though part of me felt a twinge of pity. Just a twinge. 2 days later, the worst came to pass. Dorian was officially terminated. The board's investigation moved forward, and his medical license was in jeopardy. Clara told me he was spiraling, drinking, lashing out. He'd begun verbally abusing Andrea. The fantasy was over. All that remained was fallout. "She finally sees him for who he is," Clara said during yet another coffee meetup. But she's trapped. He's unstable. She's scared to leave and too ashamed to come home. Dad offered to help. She refused. I nodded, listening. Inside, I felt grim satisfaction, not gloating, just justice, in its purest, slowest form. That night, around 2 a.m., my doorbell rang. I checked the security feed. Dorian stood on my porch, swaying, clearly drunk. I didn't open the door. I didn't say a word. He rang again, then pounded on the door, shouting slurred threats and nonsense. I called the police, logged the video, and submitted a report the following morning. 3 days later, I found my mailbox dented. The day after that, I noticed one of my Tacoma's tires was losing air. I didn't react. I simply upgraded my security system, added more cameras, tracked everything. Then, the next evening, around 9 p.m., the doorbell rang again. I wasn't expecting anyone. I checked the feed. Andrea. She looked broken. Her makeup was smeared, her eyes red and her expression hollow. I debated ignoring her. Every instinct told me to let the moment pass. But I was curious, so I pressed the intercom. What do you want? Victor, please. I need to talk. Just 5 minutes. Against better judgment, I opened the door but didn't step aside. I stood in the doorway, blocking entry. Andrea looked like a ghost of herself. You were right, she said, about everything. Dorian's not who I thought he was. He lied about his finances, his past, and even medical stuff. I've made a terrible mistake. The worst mistake of my life. That's so? I said, voice flat. I had everything with you. Stability, love, safety. And I threw it away for this. For someone who's destroying everything. Still not seeing how this is my problem. Please, Victor, she begged. I need help. Dorian's license is gone. The condo's about to be foreclosed. He's leveraged to the ceiling. He's drinking every night. Last night, he shoved me into a wall. I stared at her. Call the police, I said. You know, the proper authorities. I can't, she whispered. I have nowhere to go. My parents are out of town. Clara's place is tiny. I just need a few days, just until I figure things out. I laughed, an actual uncontrollable laugh. You're kidding, right? You want to stay here, in my house, after what you did? I know I don't deserve your help, she said quickly, but you're the only person who's ever really cared about me. Stop, I said, holding up a hand. Just stop. She blinked at me, startled. The woman I loved wouldn't have left me a breakup note in a birthday gift box, wouldn't have stolen my family heirlooms out of spite, wouldn't have moved in with another man before I'd even found time to grieve. I didn't know what to do. I was confused. Dorian manipulated. No, I cut in. You made choices, adult choices, and now you get to live with them. Her face shifted. The tears dried. The sadness flickered into anger, entitlement returning to the surface. So that's it? She snapped. You're just going to let me end up on the street after 4 years together? Funny how that works, isn't it? I said, stepping back just enough to savor the moment. By the way, how's Dorian's career these days? Heard things got complicated. Andrea's face contorted, realization slowly dawning in her eyes. It was you, she whispered. You reported him. I shrugged casually. Someone had to keep an impaired surgeon from endangering lives. Think of it as community service. You ruined his life, his career, everything we had. I didn't flinch. His addiction, his arrogance, and your choices did that. I just made sure the right people were paying attention when it mattered. I leaned in, lowering my voice slightly. And for what it's worth, I didn't do it alone. Her jaw twitched. Clara, she muttered, the betrayal registering like a punch to the gut. And Stephanie, I added. Turns out people don't enjoy being manipulated, lied to, or tossed aside. Something to remember if there's ever a next time. She didn't reply. She just turned and left, retreating down my porch with that same brittle dignity she always used to mask her shame. But the fallout wasn't over. The very next day, Dorian returned, drunk again, pounding on my door at 11 o'clock in the morning like a man possessed. I didn't entertain him. I simply called the police and watched from my camera feed as they hauled him off, warning him sternly about trespassing and public intoxication. I added the footage to the growing digital folder I'd titled, Just in Case. Andrea, perhaps sensing brute force wouldn't work, tried a different tactic. She sent her father. Thomas Whitfield stood stiffly on my porch, looking more like a lawyer in court than a father pleading for his daughter. "Victor," he began cautiously, "I understand there have been some unfortunate developments regarding Dorian." "Very unfortunate," I agreed, folding my arms. "Addiction's a hell of a disease." Thomas's brow furrowed. "Yes, well, Andrea finds herself in a difficult situation." "She certainly does," I echoed, expression flat. He cleared his throat, clearly uncomfortable. "I realize you and Andrea have history, and that it's complicated. But as her father, I'm concerned for her safety and well-being. She's vulnerable. As you should be. But what does that have to do with me?" He hesitated. "I was hoping we might reach an understanding, a temporary truce. She needs somewhere to stay, just until she can get on her feet again." I raised an eyebrow. "You're asking me to house your daughter. The same daughter who left me for another man, stole from me, and demanded half my home despite never contributing to it." His face reddened slightly. "I understand it's a lot to ask." "Unusual?" I scoffed. "It's delusional." He composed himself and offered the deal. $20,000, 2 months, no strings. I stared at him for a long moment. "You're offering to pay me to babysit your adult daughter, to clean up her mess. I'm trying to protect her." And where was this protective instinct? "When she was playing house with a man you knew was still married?" Thomas blinked. "How did you—" "Dorian was legally married when they started dating," I said coolly. "To his second wife. I looked into it, just like I looked into his prescription habits, his license irregularities, and the complaints that never made it into the hospital newsletters." He was silent for a beat, then asked, "What do you want, Victor?" I answered simply, "Nothing. From you or Andrea. I just want peace and space to rebuild the life your daughter destroyed." As he turned to leave, I added, "For what it's worth, Clara tried to warn her. Maybe next time, listen to the daughter who actually has a conscience." In the weeks that followed, the desperate outreach continued. Andrea left tearful voicemails. Dorian, when sober enough, sent angry, threatening texts that I cataloged and forwarded to his legal team. Thomas came back with a higher offer, $50,000 this time. I turned them all down. Eventually, they got the message. Andrea moved back into her parents' home, tail firmly between her legs. Dorian skipped town entirely. Last I heard, he was facing criminal charges related to prescription fraud, and his medical license had been officially revoked. The couple who once seemed like they were living the dream had crashed and burned in front of everyone. Andrea's Instagram, formerly flooded with curated shots of designer handbags, vacations, and glowing Chakosh power couple posts, devolved into vague, sad quotes about healing and second chances. Gone were the fire emojis and couple goals comments. Her social circle vanished like smoke in the wind. Clara told me that Andrea had been bouncing from one friend's couch to another, before finally giving up and moving home. Her hospital contacts ghosted her. Her pharmaceutical employer, eager to distance itself from the scandal, placed her on unpaid administrative leave. Even a tangential connection to prescription abuse was too much risk for a company in that field. Her entire identity, built on status, image, validation, crumbled beneath her. Meanwhile, I got my life back. I kept the house, bought the dog I'd always wanted, a rescue lab mix named Cooper. Max, surprisingly, warmed up to him after a while. I started playing basketball with Joseph again, installed a new sound system in my Tacoma, and finally replaced those old tires. Clara and I still grab coffee now and then. Just friends. For now. She's nothing like her sister. That's the highest compliment I can give anyone. I sold the engagement ring, took that money and didn't look back. Because sometimes the most satisfying revenge isn't about retaliation. It's not about anger or pain or making someone suffer. Sometimes, the best revenge is letting them see exactly what they threw away, and knowing they'll never get it back. It's been 6 months now. Life has a funny way of self-correcting. As I sit here typing this, Cooper is sprawled out on the floor at my feet, snoring softly. Max is perched on the armrest of my dad's old recliner, tail swishing like a metronome. The best decision I ever made was keeping both of them, and letting go of the people who never truly belonged. They don't care if I drive the latest model or flaunt some six-figure lifestyle. They don't judge me based on my wardrobe or the brand of my watch. The people in my life now, they respect me for who I am, my integrity, my loyalty, my perseverance. Not for appearances, not for show. They don't give a damn about my earning potential or whether I park a luxury vehicle outside my house. And I've never felt more at peace. Work has been solid. Last month, I got promoted to project lead, a role I earned through sheer grit and late nights. After Andrea left, I buried myself in overtime hours of zoning in on blueprints, organizing construction timelines, and mentoring junior engineers. It wasn't about distraction. It was about purpose. About proving that heartbreak didn't define my trajectory. That dedication did. The extra effort didn't go unnoticed, and when the opportunity came up, I was the first name they considered. There's a quiet satisfaction in that kind of recognition. The kind built, not given. As for Andrea and Dorian, the aftermath has been more satisfying than I ever anticipated. Justice, when it comes slow and steady, tastes better than revenge ever could. Dorian's temporary license suspension was made permanent once the investigation dug deeper. It turned out he hadn't just been using prescription drugs illegally. He'd been writing scripts under other doctors' DEA numbers, effectively impersonating them. That opened up a whole new world of criminal liability, federal charges, DEA scrutiny, his once glittering future as a neurosurgeon, gone. Last I heard from Joseph, Dorian had filed for bankruptcy and moved back to Ohio to live with his aging parents. The $1.2 million mansion, foreclosed, his prized Maserati, repossessed right outside the hospital in full view of staff. Joseph said it became instant hospital legend, the moment when Dr. D hit rock bottom in real time. Andrea didn't escape unscathed either. Her pharmaceutical sales career, once promising and fast-tracked, crashed into the reality of guilt by association. Clients stopped taking her seriously. Selling to doctors became difficult when she was known for dating one who lost his license for narcotics violations. She tried to pivot, to clean up the mess, but word spreads fast in medical circles. Eventually, she landed a lower-paying job at a small-scale firm, a shadow of the power position she once held. From what I heard, it's more grind than glamour now. And all the perks she once boasted about? Gone. Last week, I spotted her at a traffic light. I was in my freshly detailed Tacoma, upgraded wheels gleaming. She was in her dad's old Honda, a far cry from the Range Rover she used to flaunt. Our eyes met briefly. I didn't nod. I didn't glare. I didn't even acknowledge her beyond that fleeting glance. I just drove on. But in the rearview mirror, I saw her still sitting there after the light turned green. That, I think, stung her more than anything I could have said. Even Thomas, her ever-loyal father, couldn't escape the fallout. Those cabin photos? Somehow they made their way to Mrs. Whitfield. No, I didn't leak them. I had nothing to gain, but when she saw them, she was livid. Not just because of the affair, but because Thomas had actively shielded Andrea's lie. Because he'd enabled her betrayal. Clara told me their fight was volcanic. Thomas spent a month sleeping at his law office. I can only imagine the tension in that house. Speaking of Clara, those coffee meetings we used to have, they gradually turned into dinners. And those dinners, they became something more. We moved slowly, both of us cautious for obvious reasons. But there's a sincerity between us I never had before. With Clara, there's no pretending, no power games, just kindness, humor, and something surprisingly steady. Andrea found out 3 weeks ago. She dropped by her parents' place unannounced and saw us having dinner with them. The meltdown that followed was cinematic, accusations, wild claims that I was using Clara for revenge. She screamed, demanded to know how I could do this to her. Clara, usually so reserved, calmly ended the spectacle with just 5 words. "Not everything is about you." And in that moment, I'd never felt prouder of anyone in my life. There's a deep irony in all of this that doesn't escape me. Andrea threw away a stable, meaningful relationship for a fantasy that collapsed under the weight of its own deception. And in the aftermath, I found something genuine with someone who had been right there all along, someone who never tried to change me, someone who saw value in what others ignored. Andrea's parents? Surprisingly, they've been supportive. I think in some unspoken way they see this as karmic justice, a balancing of the scales. So that's where things stand. Life didn't just go on, it got better.